Africans and the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery existed in Africa, including the extensive enslavement of women as household workers, well before Europeans sought labor for their investments in the Americas. For example, in many societies, the entire community shared the land. In order to establish positions of wealth and power, individuals not only showcased the property they owned, but also showcased their slaves. Europeans were also not the first foreigners to seek out African labor. Arab merchants during the post-classical era of 600 to 1450 often bought slaves during their travels to the Swahili coast of East Africa. However, it was the Atlantic slave trade that wreaked the most havoc on African societies. Why Africans? Several factors converged to make Africa a target for slave raids by Europeans after 1450. As discussed in previous chapters, slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean began toward the end of the 16th century, when European conquistadors sought fortunes in gold, silver, and sugar. Land was plentiful, but labor to make the land profitable was scarce. Europeans initially forced indigenous people to do the hard labor of mining and farming, but European diseases wiped out large portions of these coerced laborers. The indigenous slaves who survived found it easy to escape bondage because they were more familiar with the territory, had social networks that could protect them, and could easily camouflage themselves within the native population. Repeated efforts to enslave Native Americans failed, although other efforts to coerce labor did have some success. Labor for plantations. In North America, plantation owners recruited European indentured servants who would come to work for a specified period in exchange for passage, room, and board. However, most of these people were unaccustomed to the backbreaking agricultural working conditions and the climate of the Americas. In addition, indentured servants were required to work only for about 7 years. If they survived their indenture, they became free laborers. Thus, landowners did not think of indigenous captives and European indentured servants as ideal workers. During this era, Europeans sought sources of inexpensive labor in the Americas. Western European countries, such as Portugal, Spain, and England, were developing their naval technology, but Portugal was ahead of the others. In West Africa, during the latter part of the 1400s, Portuguese trading fleets arrived in the Kingdom of the Congo seeking slaves. Initially, they took the enslaved Africans back to Europe to work as domestic servants. Triangular trade. The Europeans' desire for slaves in the Americas, coupled with Portugal's discovery of West Africa, meant that Africa became the source for new labor. African slaves soon became part of a complex global trading system that was called the Atlantic Trading System, or the Triangular Trade, based on a trade cycle with 3 legs. One version of triangular trade involved the transport of European manufactured goods, such as firearms, to West Africa, and from there, enslaved Africans were shipped to the Americas. The final leg involved the transport of American tobacco and other cash crops to Europe. Once other European nations noticed the success that the Portuguese enjoyed with sugar plantations in Brazil, the English, Dutch, and French worked to replicate that success in the Caribbean. By the 1700s, sugar production and rum, made from sugar, were financing fortunes in Britain and to a lesser extent in France and the Netherlands. Capture and shipment of slaves to the Americas. Capturing Africans for slavery was invariably a violent affair. When African leaders along the coast realized that their kingdoms could economically benefit from the slave trade, they invaded neighboring societies in a quest for slaves to take back to the coast. At times, African rulers were also willing to hand over individuals from the lower rung of their own societies, such as prisoners of war, servants, or criminals. However, as King Afonso suggested to the King of Portugal in the quotation that opens this chapter, slave raids were not easily controllable. Though he had initially allowed slave trading in his kingdom, he had no intention of giving up his society's elite to slavery, nor did he want Congo to be depopulated. King Afonso also saw that his authority was undermined because his subjects were able to trade slaves for European goods without his involvement. Before the Europeans came, he had been able to control all trade in his domain. Captive Africans swept away from their families were taken to holding pens in West Africa. From these holding pens, slave traders next crammed their captives into the dark cargo section of a ship, providing them little water, food, or even room for movement. The grueling journey across the Atlantic was known as the Middle Passage because it was the middle part of the captive's journey. Many captured Africans staged rebellions en route, but most revolts were crushed. The 1997 film Amistad provides an example of a successful Middle Passage rebellion in 1839 in which Africans took control of the Spanish slave ship Amistad. During the journey to the Americas, which usually took about 6 weeks, up to half of a ship's captives might die. Historians estimate that over the hundreds of years of the Atlantic slave trade from the early 1500s to the mid-19th century, approximately 25% of all African captives perished before reaching the Americas. The effects of the slave trade on Africa. The Atlantic slave trade affected Africa in social, economic, and political ways. Those most affected were the peoples and civilizations of West Africa in present-day Ghana and Benin, from which most Africans were kidnapped or sold. Gender distributions in those regions became severely imbalanced because more than 2/3 of those taken were males. The resulting predominance of women prompted a rise in polygyny, the taking of more than one wife, and forced women to assume duties that had traditionally been men's jobs. Economically, African societies that conducted slave raids, such as the Dahomey and the Oyo, became richer from selling their captives to Europeans. This trade also had political effects, because when a society like the Dahomey exchanged slaves for guns, its raiders easily took advantage of rival societies that had no firearms. Without firearms, it was hard for neighboring groups to resist slave raids, so raiding societies became even richer and more fortified with firearms. Intergroup warfare thus became more common and bloodier as a result of the slave trade. People of European descent were not solely responsible for ending the slave trade in the Americas. Slave revolts were common, especially in those locations where enslaved Africans outnumbered free Europeans. In fact, slave revolts in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century were so successful that they brought the end of slavery to the island in 1804, giving the newly independent nation of Haiti the distinction of being the first country in the Americas to end slavery. By 1888, slavery would be abolished throughout the Americas, usually through a gradual process of abolition. Haiti and the United States were the only two countries to end slavery through a full-scale war. African presence in the Americas. African cultures were not completely lost once captives arrived in the Americas. In fact, during the African diaspora, the dispersion of Africans out of Africa, enslaved Africans managed to retain certain aspects of their culture in their new environments. Languages. With a few exceptions, Africans were not able to transplant their languages to the Americas. The captives were spirited away from their communities, and they soon found themselves on ships among captives from all across West Africa, and on some slave ships from across East Africa as well. Since captives were taken from myriad African culture groups, most did not share a common language. Understandably, they found it difficult, if not impossible, to communicate en route. Because of their linguistic isolation on the ships and in the Americas, most Africans lost their languages after a generation. In spite of this forced isolation from their cultures, West Africans managed to combine European colonizers' languages, English, Spanish, French, or Portuguese, for example, with parts of their West African languages and grammatical patterns to create new languages known broadly as Creole. Because the Caribbean islands had a larger concentration of enslaved Africans than did North America, Creole languages dominate there even today. In the United States, which had a smaller percentage of Africans in comparison to the total population, few examples of Creole languages exist. One notable exception is the Gullah and Geechee language of South Carolina and Georgia, in places where slaves once composed 75% of the population. Religions. African religions in the Americas provided powerful examples of religious syncretism, or the combining of different religious beliefs and practices. Africans melded aspects of Christianity that were introduced to them, or imposed upon them, with their West African religious traditions, such as drumming, dancing, and a belief in spirits that could possess or take over and act through a person, often in evil ways. The traditions of Santeria in Cuba, Vodun in Haiti, and Candomblé in Brazil were all combinations of Christian and traditional African religions. Enslaved Africans in the United States also laid the roots for the African American Church, a hybrid of Christianity and African spiritual traditions that remains one of the oldest and most stable institutions in African American communities today. Some of the enslaved Africans, maybe 10%, practiced Islam. While some of the men who sailed with Columbus may have been Muslims, these enslaved Africans became the first significant presence of Islam in the Americas. Music. Africans brought their music with them. Today's music, including gospel, blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip-hop, samba, reggae, and country music, are all influenced by African music. The syncopated rhythms and percussion in contemporary music can be traced back to West African musical traditions. Perhaps many African descendants maintained their musical traditions because enslaved Africans in America used music as a means of survival, singing tunes from home to help them endure long work days, as well as to communicate with other slaves, such as when planning an escape. They blended European Christian music with their own religious songs, known today as Negro spirituals, essential elements of American folk music history. Slaves also invented the banjo, which is very similar to stringed instruments found in West Africa. Food. Africans brought rice and okra, a green vegetable, to the Americas, as well as their knowledge of how to prepare these foods. The dish known as gumbo, popular in the southern United States, has roots in African cooking. With influences on language, music, food, and much more, African culture has had a profound and lasting impact on the Americas. Historical perspectives. What was slavery's impact? Historians have long debated the legacy of transatlantic slavery. It has shaped both economic and cultural developments in the Americas. Slavery and Capitalism. In his book, Capitalism and Slavery, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, 1944, historian Eric Williams, who was also the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, posited that without slavery in the Americas, the European Industrial Revolution and capitalism as we know it would never have existed. Williams was thus one of the first to draw connections between the wealth of Western European countries and their involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. 30 years later, Eugene Genovese's seminal work, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made, New York Pantheon, 1974, described in great detail the social and cultural history of slavery, primarily in North America. African heritage. One public debate around African history in the Americas concerns the extent to which peoples of African descent actually retained remnants of African culture. The Black English controversy is a notable example of this debate. Linguists who study Creole and Black English have traced the grammatical patterns back to West Africa. For example, many West African languages do not conjugate the verb to be, and linguists also observe this lack of conjugation among some people of African descent in the Americas. The validity of Black English as a dialect sparked a huge controversy in the media, touching on the question of whether Africa had a central place in the discussion about African American history and culture. Authors Joseph Holloway addressed the issue in his book, Africanisms in American Culture, Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 1999, showcasing research on the aspects of African culture that continue to exist in the Americas in music, religion, and other areas, with particular case studies in New Orleans and of Gullah culture in South Carolina. The book provides a unique perspective on the many connections among the cultures of the African diaspora. Slavery and industrial power. Most recently, in 2014, historian Edward E. Baptiste published Slavery, The Half That Has Never Been Told. Baptiste argued that the expansion of slavery and cotton production in the United States in the 19th century provided the foundation for the country's rise to its status as a global industrial power.